So for part A, what we want to do, let's go ahead and see according to our steps. So our first one, we want to go ahead and find factors of our constant term, or in other words, finding our factors of our p. So let's go ahead, find the factors of p, or factors of our constant term. So our constant term is going to be right here with this 4. So we want to go ahead and find factors of this 4. So p right here, factors of 4. So potentially we could have plus or minus 1. We might have plus or minus 2. And we might have plus or minus 4, right? We need to take care of our negative and our positive values, because -1 and -4 would get us that 4. -2 and -2 would get us the 4, etc. So this will take care of our step number 1. Let's go ahead and look at step 2. That says find factors of our leading coefficient here. And our leading coefficient is going to be this 8 up here. So I'll go ahead and get a different color here. Let's say this purple. It's going to be this 8 right here. So we want to find factors of the 8. So in other words, our Q is going to be factors of our 8. So factors of 8, similar to the way that we did our 4, we might have plus or minus 1. We might have plus or minus 2. And we might have plus or minus 4, and then plus or minus 8. So we found our P and we found our Q factors. So we can now go ahead and move on to part 3, which says we basically take our P factors and divide them by our Q factors. So let's go ahead and systematically do this so that we don't miss any of our factors here. So let's go ahead and take P and divide it by Q. Or in other words, this is also our list of possible rational zeros. So let's take P, which is plus or minus 1, and divide it by our first one in Q, which is plus or minus 1. So plus or minus 1 divided by plus or minus 1 would get me a plus or minus 1. So let's still start with this plus or minus 1 and then divide it by the plus or minus 2. So plus or minus 1 divided by plus or minus 2 will get me a plus or minus 1/2. Okay, and then plus or minus 1 divided by plus or minus 4 gets me a plus or minus 1/4. And then our last one is going to be plus or minus 1 divided by plus or minus 8, which gets me plus or minus 1/8. All right, now we can go ahead and move on to our second element, which is going to be this plus or minus 2, and divide it by our factors of our 8 or our Q. So in this case, that will be a 2 divided by plus or minus 1, which is plus or minus 2. And then we'll have a plus or minus 2 divided by plus or minus 2. Well, that's just plus or minus 1, and we already have it, so there's no sense in repeating it. So let's move on to the second one. Plus or minus 2 divided by plus or minus 4. Well, that just gets us a plus or minus 1/2. Again, we have that, so there's no sense in repeating it. And our last one is going to be plus or minus 2 divided by plus or minus 8. And again, that's going to get us a 1/4, which again, we already have, so there's no sense in repeating it. So now what we can do is go ahead and move on to our last one, which is going to be this plus or minus 4 here, and divided by all of our elements of our factors of 8. So plus or minus 4 divided by plus or minus 1, that gets us plus or minus 4, which we don't have yet, so let's go ahead and write that. And plus or minus 4 divided by plus or minus 2 is a plus or minus 2, we already have that. Plus or minus 4 divided by plus or minus 4 is a 1, again we already have that. And then a plus or minus 4 divided by plus or minus 8 is a 1/2, which we already have. So this should give us our possible rational zeros list, and we are good to go as far as our part A, as it just asks for our possible rational zeros. So let's go ahead and move on to part B. So part B is going to be looking at steps 5 through 8. So in your case, if it just asks you to list the possible rational zeros, you would then stop at what we just did. So in this case, let's go ahead and move on and start looking at our steps 5 through 8. So our step 5, it says use synthetic division to find zeros by trial and error. Then we'll go ahead, find that our constant term is 0, and then we'll go ahead and try to make sure that our zeros are factored out and that we're changing our signs. So let's go ahead and set up our synthetic division and test our different values by trial and error. So let's see. Let's first start with plus or minus 1 here. So if we start with plus or minus 1, let's first start with the positive 1 and then move on to the negative 1 and see if this gives us any zeros. So alright, so we will have a 1 on the outside, and then we will go ahead and use our coefficients from up here. So that will give us a positive 8 in this case, a negative 26, negative 27, a positive 11, and then finally a positive 4. So we'll have a positive 8, negative 26, negative 27, and then finally 11 and a 4. So bring the first term down, so that's going to be an 8 times a 1, positive 8. And then go ahead and continue to add the columns here, so that will give us a negative 18. And then go ahead and multiply and then continue the process of adding the columns. So that will give us a negative 18, which is a negative 45, negative 45, negative 34, negative 34 times 1, negative 34, which will give us a remainder of a negative 30. So this is not the remainder of 0 that we wanted, so let's go ahead and try the negative 1 now. So negative 1, again we're going to go ahead and use the same coefficients. Bring your first term down, so that will give us an 8, and then multiply and then add. So this will give us a negative 8, and then a negative 34, positive 34, a 7, a negative 7, a positive 4, a negative 4, and then a remainder of a 0, which is what we indeed wanted. So we can therefore conclude that f of negative 1 is equal to our remainder there, right, of a 0. So this negative 1 is coming from this number that we tried. So what we can proceed to do now is go ahead and find some more potential rational zeros, or testing them. So instead of using our previous coefficients, we now want to go ahead and use our quotient that we just found as our new numbers for synthetic division. So let's go ahead and set it up and continue to test some more numbers. So in this case, by trial and error, you might find you want to test the positive 4 and negative 4. I already know that these will work, but in your case, you might have to test a little bit more of the possible rational zeros. So let's go ahead and try the positive 4. So trying the positive 4, we will have a 4 on the outside, and now we will use the 8, the negative 34, 7, and 4 as our new numbers. So this will give us a positive 8, negative 34, 7, and then a 4. So bring your first term down. That'll give us an 8. and then continue the process of multiplying and adding. So this will be a 32, which gives us a negative 2. And then negative 2 times 4 gets us negative 8, and then we will have a negative 1, and then finally a negative 4. So again, this will get us a remainder of 0. So we can therefore conclude that f of, in this case, our 4, which is going to be this number on the outside, is going to be equal to 0. So the reason we stop here is because since we dealt with our degree of 4 here, our first synthetic division, our quotient is going to be x raised to the third. And then after we completed our second round of synthetic division, finding our 0, that is going to be x to the 2. So we want to stop here because this is going to give us a quadratic that we can factor out. So we therefore know that f of x is going to be equal to, and what factors do we know? Well, we know that we had a negative 1, and then we had a positive 4. So this is where step number 8 comes in, where we want to make sure that we change our signs when we put it back in. So this will now give us x plus 1 and x minus a 4. And then our quotient remaining is 8x squared minus 2x, and then finally minus 1. Alright, and now we want to go ahead and see if we can factor this 8x squared minus 2x minus 1 out. So let's go ahead. 8 times the negative 1 gets me a negative 8. So in other words, we want two numbers that multiply to negative 8, and added or subtracted gets us this negative 2. So in our case, what this will give us, negative 4 and a positive 2. Let's go ahead and reduce. This first one will reduce to 2x minus 1, and then our second one will reduce to 4x plus 1, leaving us with our entire result. We'll have the x plus 1, the x minus 4, and then our factored out portion into linear terms, and this is going to be our f of x. So we can therefore conclude from this information that our zeros are, we said negative 1, we said positive 4, and then if we solve these, 2x minus 1 equal to 0, we get that x is equal to positive 1/2, and then if we solve this right hand portion here, we'll get 4x plus 1 equal to 0, which will get us an x is equal to negative 1/4. So we know that we have 1/2 as well as a negative 1/4. So these are our final zeros. We have 4 of them, a negative 1, 4, 1/2, and then a negative 1/4. So